personalize them. And that's why, Katie, I may just wait, and that division we did before the break is actually going to possibly show back up in imaginary numbers. So it all kind of runs together. So I've just got to figure out. But I'll absolutely say you will not have a quiz Monday. Let's multiply. Let's do 2 plus 4i times 3 minus 7i. Okay, how do you multiply two binomials? 4. So F is 6. And then my outside is negative 14i. My inside is plus 12i. And my last is negative 28i squared. Now here's where it's a little different, because I is not a variable here, even though it acts like a variable until you raise it to a power. So let's talk about it. We'll put all the steps in here. So I've got a 6. Can I go ahead and put these together? Would you be okay with that? Negative 14i plus 12i is going to be negative 2i. But tell me about that thing right there. What is I squared? Right here. Remember I told you that's the one you got to know. It's negative 1, isn't it? So this means negative 28 times negative 1. That's the new part, because I is not a number, not a variable, it's a number. And that's where the powers will get you. If it's an I cubed, it's going to become negative I. If it's an I to the 4th, it actually becomes a 1. But this is the most common one, is the I squared. And so that's going to be plus 28. See, because you got negative 28 times negative 1. Now we can clean it up. Let's write it in complex form. So I've got 6 plus 28 is 34 minus 2i. Now, could the i's drop out? Yes. You might have, negative 49, positive 49. Then it would be, you could either write it 34 plus 0i or just 34. I don't have a problem with you leaving it like that. Yes, sir. What did I do? Oh, okay. Let's do another one of those. And then we're going to talk about simplifying them. I never have pushed it. I had trouble finding these, so I ended up just having to put some on your classwork that I did, because this is really this right here, and the idea of doing something with a squared, and then doing problems like the square root of negative 4 is what gets you. It's the people that didn't have their chargers. They didn't. Well, probably because they've already called them and they didn't come, so they probably had to call them again. Because she probably earlier said everybody that hadn't come now, and they just probably didn't do it. Okay, I wasn't going to do one of these because I always like you to have to think, and ACT loves to put a binomial squared, because a lot of people want to square that one and square that one, but you have to remember it means this. Now, I will tell you that on the ACT, if they give you a problem with i's in them, they're going to say at the beginning of the problem, it's going to say if the square root of negative 1 equals I, and then they would tell you to do this. So they will remind you that this is true before you have a problem in ACT. I would say you would have at least one imaginary problem on it. The reason I know that is because there was one on the pre-ACT, because we actually were talking about it on Monday. We looked at it. Now we just distribute. F 16 minus 4i, that's my outside. Inside is minus 4i. And my last is positive I squared. Okay, so I've got 16 minus 8i. Now what's positive I squared going to become? Negative 1. And then I get 15 minus 8i. It's just weird. It's just a weird thing when you get introduced to it. But you just remember when you first saw negative numbers or fractions or decimals or percents or whatever, and you don't even remember the first time you saw them, but it was like, oh, I'll never learn this. But this is about as complicated as you get with eyes, and we can get a whole lot more complicated. Now, I added these because this is really the biggie right there. Let's do the square root of, I printed out the problems. I just want to make sure I don't do one that's on your worksheet. Let's do, oh, well, that's good. I printed the answers, but not the problems, but I think I can give you some that's not on there. Let's do the square root of negative 25. Okay.
It'd be like 5 times 5 times like negative 1.
Okay, do you need all of that? I mean, you can if you want to. Negative 1 times 5 squared, if you want to put that in your notes. Do we know the square root of 5 squared? Do we know the square root of negative 1? And it's going to be 5i. Now, when you put that in quadratic form, when we go back to lesson 27 and pick up with 29, we'll now have some with imaginary complex answers. You'll have some with radicals, and it all comes down to if your quadratic equation doesn't factor. But we're fixing to add the calculator into that mix pretty quickly. Number 6, let's do the square root of negative, let's do the square root of negative 160. Okay. Square root. Now, you might want your negative 1 at the end because your I is going to go, well, I don't know. I'm going to put my negative 1 at the front just so I don't forget it. Now, 160. Honestly, I don't know its factor tree off the top of my head. Am I on screen? Let's go that way. 80, 40, 20, 10, and 5. So it's going to be 2 squared times 2 squared times 10. Well, that makes 10. So 16 times 10. So I is going to come out. 2 is going to come out. 2 is going to come out. So I'm going to put 2 times I. And we usually put it at the end, just like we do variables. And then the square root of what's left under there, a 10, which is 4i squared root of 10. Now, you usually won't see the I at the very, very end, because if you do, look what happens. You know, depending on how far you make your little radical go across, the question is that I under the radical? Now, an I under the radical is going to be a whole different ballgame, because that would be the square root of negative 1. So you get into more. You have to be careful with that. So we take care of it by simply putting it there. Now, if you had a teacher that said you had to write this in, and I'm going to write it, I don't get that particular. But what if I said to you, let's write that in complex form? Well, that is the complex part. That's the imaginary part. So there is no real part over here, so it would be 0 plus. Now, I'm going to write it on the very strict level. I'm going to put 4 squared root of 10 I, like that. Now, if I had a teacher that said you have to write it in complex form, that's the way I would have written it. Because there's my A, there's my B. Remember, B is the coefficient of the I, and then there's my I. Now, I don't get that strict, and I don't think Ms. Newberry would. I'm fine with this one. But it's just the idea, are you writing it in the form it asks for? Okay, do you need another one of those? You think you can do them? I think I added 4 to the end of it. You only have 10 problems. So this is a lesson that if you haven't knocked out lesson 27, you can get 27 and 28 knocked out pretty quick. So get those done. I absolutely have to have 28 Monday, and I really, really need 27 today if you can get it done. Okay, I'm through.